Our story begins just like any other fairy tale, once upon a time. The year was 1972 and Statoil was founded on optimism. Little did we know back then that by 2001, we would have become a publicly listed company, and 10 years later, well on our way to becoming a global energy player.
In the early 1960s, Norway was approached by the Phillips Petroleum Company with a request for an oil and gas concession covering the lands lying beneath the territorial waters of Norway, plus that portion of the continental shelf lying beneath the North Sea, which may now or in the future be under the jurisdiction of Norway. Norway had negotiated with both Denmark and Britain over this very territory. However, these negotiations had been undertaken with the goal of protecting Norwegian fisheries, and with no regard to the potential oil wealth hidden within the continental shelf. Government officials believed it to be unlikely that there was much oil located in the shelf, and they were hesitant to commit to the resources necessary to adequately carry out what they saw as a high-risk venture. Furthermore, they realized that there was very little expertise or knowledge of the oil industry within the country, making national exploration for oil much more daunting. This aversion to risk caused the government to allow several international companies to take on oil exploration within a clearly defined political framework. However, this dynamic changed when oil was discovered for the first time in 1969. The Norwegian government had seen other examples of countries that lost a great deal of their oil wealth to international companies. Because of this, Norway decided to set up a system in which they were in charge of the direction the oil industry would take from the start. In order to achieve this goal, the government created its own national company, Statoil. In order to assure that they would always have the last say in any oil-related decisions, the government passed a law stating that Statoil would be granted a minimum of a 50% direct share in every field. Furthermore, the leases that were drawn up by the government placed most of the costs that would be incurred during the exploratory phase of production on the foreign companies, while allowing Statoil to assume an even larger direct share after oil discoveries had been made. In addition to the Statoil concessions, the Norwegian government only allowed for single company leases to be submitted in order to increase competition amongst international companies. The lease agreements granted by the government allowed Statoil to avoid taking on too much risk while maximizing the expertise brought in by outside companies. The government's action during this period ensured that Statoil would be the dominant player in the Norwegian oil market. Furthermore, collaborations with international companies allowed the Norwegian firm to gain access to knowledge and expertise that began to make the company more and more independent. Throughout the 1980s, Statoil rapidly increased production throughout the North Sea, becoming a bigger and bigger part of Norway's economy. Furthermore, the government became increasingly dependent on Statoil's revenue to meet its budgetary requirements. On top of this massive expansion in production, Statoil began branching out into other areas of the oil industry by building commercial gas stations both at home and abroad. These actions were taken to protect the company by allowing it to coordinate its production and refining efforts with the sale of its finished product. The combination of increased oil extraction with new commercial revenue streams allowed Statoil to begin to act more independently. This independence and Statoil's general success prompted many in the government to question the revenue split that existed between the Treasury and the company. The country, under conservative leadership, changed this revenue split to more accurately reflect the benefits that Statoil was receiving because of the backing that it received from the government. This new split divided the money that came in through rents from the money Statoil was making through oil production and other commercial activities. While these actions were intended to reassert the power of the state over the company, by dividing Statoil's revenue streams clearly between government revenue and corporate revenue, Norway took the first step in turning Statoil into a private company. While the 80s and 90s saw huge increases in oil production, the market for oil became much more volatile. Between the years 1985 and 86, the price of oil was halved, wreaking havoc on the Norwegian economy, government revenues, and Statoil's profits. While prices started recovering towards the end of the 80s, internally, Statoil began to have problems with corruption and mismanagement. These problems were exacerbated by the increasing competition that the company was faced with abroad. If Statoil was going to remain competitive in an evolving global market, it was going to have to go through severe changes. Furthermore, it became increasingly clear to the Norwegian government that having a buffer against the volatility of the oil market was necessary if their country was going to be able to withstand another oil shock. This line of thinking led to the creation of the Norwegian Oil Fund, which made sure that excess revenues were saved in order to cushion against any collapse in oil prices that might occur. A quick aside on the Norwegian government's buffer. This fund, which was created in 1996, has been used in an extremely disciplined manner and has helped Norway achieve large budget surpluses despite the fact that the government runs a very robust welfare state. The Norwegian Central Bank manages this oil money, and under its careful stewardship, the fund has reached a total of over $700 billion. This amount looks even more impressive when one takes into account how small the population of Norway is. The creation of this fund incentivized the Norwegian government to give Statoil even more freedom to operate in a way that would maximize both corporate profits and government revenue. In 2001, Statoil was finally privatized and became listed on the Oslo Stock Exchange and the New York Stock Exchange. This change was pushed by company directors who believed that they needed more flexibility in order to begin exploring for oil outside of Norway's borders. Furthermore, by becoming a publicly traded company, it became significantly easier for Statoil to work with other international oil companies. However, Statoil brought in too much revenue for the government to completely let it go. As soon as the company went public, the Norwegian state bought up around 64% of the shares. In doing so, the government allowed Statoil to operate with fewer restraints, while still having the company's profits help to grow the Oil Wealth Fund. Because of this hands-off model, Statoil has been able to successfully make the transition from a national oil company to an international energy giant. Statoil now has significant holdings around the world and is even beginning to get involved in the shale gas movement in the United States. However, while freeing Statoil from direct government control allowed the company to pursue new types of ventures, this freedom also had a dark side. While Statoil was under Norwegian control, the government passed the 10 Commandments of oil production to ensure that the exploitation of this resource wouldn't have negative consequences down the road. One of these commandments stated that the development of an oil industry must take necessary account of existing industrial activities and the protection of nature and the environment. In the years following privatization, Statoil seems to have forgotten this basic rule, as one of its ocean rigs has had 3 spills in the past 5 years. Furthermore, Statoil has been accused of bribing officials in both Iran and Syria in order to gain favorable oil contracts. While none of these incidents have made a real dent in Statoil's reputation, they do seem to point at a company that is slipping. Peak oil in Norway was reached in 2001, and Statoil has been struggling to make up for declining production ever since. In addition to its shale gas explorations in North America, Statoil has been looking for alternative ways to continue to grow a company whose most reliable revenue stream is slowly diminishing. Some of these alternatives come in the form of renewable energy. The company has taken advantage of the placement of some of its ocean rigs to set up wind turbines. Additionally, Statoil has begun to embrace geothermal power as a means of supplementing traditional energy sources. However, these types of energy investments are far less profitable than the oil industry, which is still where Statoil is choosing to focus. On this front, the company has used strategic mergers like the relatively recent purchase of Norsk Hydro to tap into other oil-based revenue streams. While it is still too early to judge the success of this strategy, it has allowed Statoil to keep growing despite declining production in its home country. While Statoil's future is relatively murky as it pursues international opportunities, one thing that is clear is how the Norwegian government's policies allowed their quasi-nationalization of the oil industry to be a success. From the start, the government had a very good sense of when to get involved and when to allow experts with better knowledge to make decisions. This applies to their acceptance of the aid of international companies right when oil was discovered, and it applies to their ever-shrinking influence on the corporate policies of Statoil as the company grew. Additionally, Norway's disciplined approach in saving a large amount of the revenue produced by the national oil industry prevented corruption from becoming too rampant. Granted, all of Norway's efforts were aided by the fact that it is able to export the most oil per capita in the world. However, a large amount of oil does not a stable country make. In all, the future of both Statoil and Norway looked bright because of the care that they took in avoiding the oil curse and maintaining a functioning democracy despite discovering the embarrassment of riches that they didn't know they had.
Through global exploration like the Skrugard and Johan Sverdrup discoveries at the Norwegian continental shelf, the Peregrino South in Brazil, and early moves into unconventional resources in North America, future steps are taken, representing the same old optimisms we were founded on. For 10 years, we have delivered sector-leading shareholder return through developing a sustainable and values-based business and culture, telling us that how we work is of key importance to the goals we achieve. This is our story, and it has just begun.